Hi, I'm Jason Gorber from thatshelf.com, and I'm sitting here in front of the 2020 LG 77-inch OLED, the CX or the C10 model. I've had this television for a few months now, really given it a workout, waited for some firmware to stabilize, and figured out the best way to actually get the most out of the television. And I gotta say, it's obviously a remarkable set. The technology is absolutely incredible, but it has not been without its issues. There's been all kinds of weird ups and downs. It's been professionally calibrated by a certified ISF calibrator. The colors have been exceptional, except in certain instances. The clarity has been exquisite, except in certain instances. And what it is that when you have something this revealing, when you have a set of this caliber, you run into issues because suddenly you're actually finding problems with source material, with the broadcast, with the streaming service, whatever it is, that this is going to show up. When you have something this big, you're sitting close enough to it to actually recognize the issues. You're just going to find problems that you would have been masked by other elements. I mean, it's just one of the things that you're going to get with this, but nonetheless, that's what you get with this. In terms of build quality, in terms of how the actual television mounted and stuff like that, I thought that the actual VISA spacing would be pretty much where it was on my 65 E6P, but actually it was slightly different. So the entire set had to be raised slightly in order to make it past my center speaker. Not a big deal, but it just meant that there was some adjustment. But the actual placement where the actual 4 bolts go are identical. The size difference is really about, 6-7 inches on either side. So the jump from a 65 to a 77, probably less robust than one would think just based on those numbers alone. But the real difference, not only in terms of how it actually fits my space between my left and right speakers, but weirdly, it has less to do with 16:9 material or even 235 material, which definitely is larger. I'm not suggesting it's not. It's actually 4:3 material. I find it's much, much more engaging now when watching 4:3 material. We have that much of the screen that's actually blacked off with sidebars on this size television. I've been thoroughly enjoying rewatching classics from Citizen Kane. Even Homicide: Life in the Streets I'm rewatching, and the size difference from the 65 to the 77 for that stuff is actually weirdly feels more immersive and more significant than any television I've ever had. Maybe it's just because I grew up on 4:3 and I'm used to either a 12 or 14-inch set, maybe a little black and white set, all the way up to the 20-inch Trinitron, and now I have the biggest 4:3 presentation I've ever had at home. Anybody out there with a projector knows what it's like to actually have the sort of that immersive, that falling into the screen sensation. That's what you obviously get at the movie theaters, which hopefully we'll be getting back to in time. But because of the self-illuminance of the OLED, the way that the technology actually works, it's still the clarity and the subtlety of gradations and the sheer impact between the dark and the light elements are phenomenal. And so even a top projection system isn't going to have quite the same impact in quite the same way, especially in terms of color delineation, all the subtleties of high dynamic range you get with modern discs. This is just going to simply blow it away. Still, I would trade this for a 130-inch OLED any day, but nonetheless, this is what we've got. In terms of its built-in features, it has many, many new elements that are meant to make things better for the person who just buys the television out of a box. It has all kinds of intelligent features, automatic enabling of game modes, low latency, variable refresh rate for anybody who's actually playing it with a game system, and we will be discussing that in a separate video. Equally, it has filmmaker mode, which is an automatic mode that allows the TV to sort of be set on the standard mode with a bunch of post-processing stuff like motion interpolation, all the stuff that, purists would want to turn off anyway. With filmmaker mode enabled, as soon as it sees a disc or a title that's actually tagged correctly, it recognizes this is a movie, not some TV show or sports program, and it kicks into a much more robust cinematic mode. Essentially what it does is it turns off most of the stuff that we want to turn off anyway. Now, I've long said that the number one thing to do is to buy the best damn television you can and then turn most of the stuff off. Most of it is there for people to walk into a big box store and see the best picture that they think, which is the brightest one. It's like buying a sound system because it's the loudest, not because it sounds the best. This is a quite common thing. The default modes on this are very, very bright, very, very blue, and very inaccurate. but they look pretty good under fluorescent lighting when you're in a big box store and sort of shopping and looking for what's going to have the biggest impact. Again, this is TV manufacturers knowing the people who tend to buy them, the sort of mass consumers that are going and actually just sort of scanning and looking for the biggest bang that they can for their buck. Totally understandable. Fact of the matter is that what you do is you buy a television like this and you turn off most things. You turn off all the noise reduction and the motion interpolation and smoothing and all of these things that actually interfere with the purity of the picture. Now, people occasionally want in certain circumstances, for their films to be brightened, for them to look good in their living room, which has lots of windows, for them to actually have the sort of blasting impact of all kinds of really blue, really quote-unquote bright light. People do this all the time on their phones and their monitors. But the fact is, for people who are watching these as essentially movie screens, we want it to look as accurate as possible. That is the big advantage of filmmaker mode, is that it actually in one step gets 99% of the way there of what you're going to do. That other sort of 1 or 5%, whatever which way you want to actually articulate it, is done by not only having your own calibration or getting it professionally calibrated by an ISF calibrator. That takes it that extra level where the delineation of all the color is perfect, where the gray levels are perfect, where things aren't too blue or too red, and that things are the way the filmmakers intended. That's the number one thing you want from a set like this, is to get it as close as possible. If you actually dig in the menu with the remote, I gotta say I'm not a huge fan of the new remote. It's fine, but I really do miss the one that came with my A6P. It was a longer remote, it was slightly more premium. They have a more premium remote that comes with the models above this, but again, when you're paying this much money for the television, I think it would have been such a big deal for you to actually have a bigger one. If I hit home now and I get all these boxes on the bottom, I used to have a very convenient way of going directly into my HDMI 1 mode, my ARC mode that goes directly into my Marantz system. Now I've had to actually have it so that if I hold down number 1, it'll actually kick in to my, HDMI 2, and that's the way that I will actually do it there. But if I hit home, I have access to all the built-in apps, but I don't have access immediately to the input that I want. Even if I go here to TV, that will be for live TV, or I have to go to the home dashboard, which lets me select from all kinds of stuff. But really, you just want to switch back from the built-in YouTube or the built-in Netflix directly to watch stuff off your HDMI channel. There's a little bit of workaround. I've had to program the remote, which is a little bit frustrating. To get into settings now, I can hit the gear and I can hold down the gear, which will get me as expected in the picture mode. Now you can see you have all of these different picture mode settings as per usual. If I click in here, there's the awful vivid, motion interpolation, colors on, standard, cinema home, cinema user, and game. This is on a normal Dolby Vision, which is what we're using. These are our options. It gets very confusing, and this is also key, is that each mode, Dolby Vision, regular SDR, and regular HDR, will have specific modes that have to be programmed per input. Now that's pretty good if you want to have something completely separate. For example, if you're using a different HDMI input, you are going to be able to actually have it uniquely set to that particular thing, so that if your Xbox is radically different and you want that as a completely separate input onto your television than your normal home theater preamp, that's one thing you can do. Again, you are allowed to copy it to different inputs, but you have to be clear that when you're setting your settings, you're setting it for regular TV, for HDR 4K, and for Dolby Vision 4K. Those are at least 3 separate places that you're going to want to set the things. If you go into the built-in apps, for example, YouTube or Netflix, those get set independently of what you're setting HDMI to. And this is where I'm saying the complication gets. It's a little bit confusing, once again, that Cinema User is the one that you actually use to calibrate. And you can see here, we have the regular sort of updates, especially for Dolby Vision, the regular stuff that we can actually calibrate. We have OLED light, contrast, brightness, sharpness, color, tint, and it's inside here in the advanced controls and picture options that you get these elements, and again, apply to all inputs, which is actually nice because that means for Dolby Vision, all inputs will be set with this particular mode. If you choose Cinema User, it does free up a bit of time. Under advanced controls, you can see what we've done is we've turned most of this stuff off. Dynamic contrast, super resolution. The color gamut and gamma are actually locked out because of Dolby Vision using its own tone curves. White balance, you can see what we have here. It's always on warm 2. That's your standard. If we crank it up, things get much more blue. And then we have, this is how you actually do formal calibrations. Now again, mine was professionally calibrated. We did both a 2-point and a 22-point calibration for Dolby Vision, which is actually reasonably difficult to do on Dolby Vision. Things are still a little bit flaky when it actually comes to calibrating this stuff, and most of it we actually left alone. If you go into the color management system, you can see the same thing, is that we can actually go through here and do individual tweaks per color. You can see, especially for Dolby Vision, that's all been left pretty much flat. In other words, letting the TV do what the TV needs to do. Peak brightness is set to high. All of these elements are off, and this is the big thing here. True motion, you can see what I've actually done here. I'm sort of behind me. I've been experimenting using user, de-judder at 0 and de-blur set to 10. I could just as easily turn it to off. But what this actually means, de-blur, is that anything that actually is a 60 Hertz signal will apply some form of true motion, where anything that actually is natively 24p will be left alone. Again, I've experimented to see what I actually prefer. It gets very weird when I'm actually sending stuff from my NVIDIA Shield, which keeps wanting to force things up to 60, even if it's sort of streamed at 24. That's where the balance is, but for now, that's the way I've set it up. If you go into the other options here, in additional settings, eye comfort mode, of course, off. Deep color, of course, on. AMD's FreeSync Premium. Again, my understanding as a non-gamer from what I've heard is that the difference between what FreeSync is doing and what some of your VRR and other game response elements do is that it's not such a big deal. It's basically doing it anyway, and we just have a branded version of what's actually taking place. This is for people who will be using this with their computers and an AMD card, or certain game systems that will actually take advantage of this. And then here is the Filmmaker Auto mode, is I can make it so that it automatically goes into Filmmaker mode once it recognizes a specific disc. Since my calibration basically is Filmmaker mode on 24/7, I don't actually need that. On sound, you can see that I can actually pass Dolby Atmos if I had eARC. I don't have eARC on my 8802A, which is fine. I have normal HDMI ARC, which I have done. Additional settings, you can see that we can do the normal sync adjustments. We can set individual audio formats. And one thing to note, that the new versions do not allow you to pass through DTS. They remove that. So if you're actually playing something, even from a NAS or whatever that actually has DTS, I have a couple DTS audio files that I have on my streaming box. You cannot, through the television, send over ARC to a system and have it maintain the DTS. It will not actually pass through. So even though it's on pass-through, DTS will not actually come through. Channels, this is obviously for setting the internal TV settings, connection, various networks. Mine is obviously hardwired. Under general, again, you can actually go ahead and do all kinds of nonsense in terms of making this work with your washing machine if you buy an LG washing machine. Accessibility, you can actually set to various modes, including a grayscale mode, which is actually quite interesting. And again, here's where the software updates and all those elements are. You can see that I'm running 3.1130 at the moment. I've seen multiple software updates, mostly to do actually with some of the gaming system. I haven't seen much in the way of stuff that's actually improved picture quality or actually dealt with any of the Dolby Vision issues that some people have been seeing. There's my television node, notifications, quick help, and under additional settings, you can actually go ahead and actually do certain picture tests and sound tests here. So there's plenty here to dive into, but mostly what you're going to do is this picture mode. And again, if I hit stop on this, you'll actually see that the picture mode settings changed when I'm just on the back end of my Oppo. Here on the main screen of my Oppo, the picture mode settings immediately changed to what a normal HD mode is. This is a non-HDR, an SDR mode of HD 4K. So if I go into expert mode here, you can see the OLED mode, OLED light, which was I think 100 for Dolby Vision because you want the greatest impact, down to 38. Things obviously peak if you don't have HDR. You don't want it completely in torch mode on the television. My contrast and brightness mode are changed. My color mode. And again, if I go to advanced controls, dynamic contrast, super resolution are off, but now I can actually adjust the color gamut, and you can see the set is calibrated now to gamma 2.4, which is preferred for normal SDR footage. So Dolby Vision and HDR will gray some of these elements out. For SDR, you can actually go ahead and do this. For white balance, again, a 2-point and a 22-point calibration were done. And you can see now that changes have actually been made by my professional calibrator to actually get it correct. Color management system, again, the same thing. Pretty much zeroed out on the color management system, the CMS, but our white balance is actually tuned in order for it to be perfect. Peak brightness, in this case, it was high on Dolby Vision in order for us to get the biggest bang for the buck on that. On SDR, it is set to off. If I go back here and go into picture options, again, off, off, off. Real Cinema is on because that actually is 24p. The ability to translate 24p into the additional frame rate of the television. Motion eye care off, True Motion off, completely off. Now, we do have the ability here to do black frame insertion, and that's a whole nother conversation to have. But I've found not only does it get darker, but it doesn't really help anything. It certainly doesn't help with any of the stuff that I actually watch. Again, beneficial for some things, especially sports, but nothing that I actually watch does the trick. Now, this is a very quick run through of some of the settings. There are many more people who have gone into very specific details about that. I won't bore you too much, but nonetheless, I'm just showing that if I have had to tweak a number of times by holding down the gear, going in here and doing the settings that I actually want to take care of and get all of that seen. I will do a follow-up where we're actually going to go into very specific details about the things that I really like about what the picture does and the things that have really annoyed. But I just want to get this sort of a general rundown about how this has been working, how the actual menu system works, some of the frustrations with it, and just show from the outset what we actually do when we actually want to watch stuff on this ginormous and pretty fantastic television. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe, please follow us on social, and we'll see you next movie. Cheers.